So thank you so much for having me. Today I'm going to talk to you about innovation, specifically that it's not that intimidating, it doesn't have to be that complicated, and you can totally do this so long as you work together. But first I have to admit that I am the least likely person to be talking about higher education innovation. You see, I grew up in rural Montana. I grew up in poverty, and I was one of those kids who just barely made it to the right side of the tracks, and then I ran like heck. And when I finally got to college, I really thought that if they were going to let me take out thousands of dollars in student loans, that surely the grown-ups would be watching. And they would help make sure that I made good choices, they register for the right classes. I can hear that you all know where the story goes. So I ended up graduating 7 years later with a bachelor's degree with 50 extra credits that I didn't need and the resulting student loans to show for it. And I had done something I didn't realize, which was to stumble upon a dirty little secret in higher education. And that is that higher education was not actually designed around students. It just wasn't. We haven't had the luxury of intentional design. Most of what we do is reactionary. We have to be everything to everyone, whether it's producing knowledge and discovery and groundbreaking research, economic development, social impact, teaching and learning, safety and security and efficiency and accountability, and it goes on. So ultimately, we haven't had the luxury of design, but the nice thing is we can actually address this. We can address some of the big problems in society once we recognize this. The challenges that we're facing require us to know that this is true. The first challenge that we're facing that really matters is that we're facing a shortfall of college degrees of about 11 million students. We produce college degrees in places where they used to expect them and not necessarily where they do now. People are expecting college degrees for things they didn't used to, and we fail half of all the students who walk in the door. The added complexity to this is that for the first time in US history, low-income students are now the majority of students in public K-12, which means that the students who are going to be coming en masse are going to be predominantly from a background that we don't do very well with. This is historically how we've performed in terms of giving a bachelor's degree. So students who grew up in my background, that bottom line, 6% chance of getting a bachelor's degree in the 1970s, and despite all of our talk about progress and innovation, we've actually made no progress, and we're at 9% now. So this is a really big challenge that we're facing a massive shortfall of college degrees, and the economic competitiveness of our country is at stake, that the students who are going to be coming in large mass are going to be students from a background we historically do a pretty terrible job with. The last piece that really matters is that we need to acknowledge that this system, this higher education system, was perfectly designed to get these results. And when you understand that every system is perfectly designed to get the results they do, then you can actually try and solve the problem. It's a design problem. When you recognize it's a design problem, two things happen. One, you acknowledge that there's actually no bad guy. There's nobody who's twisting their mustache in an ivory tower somewhere. Faculty and staff and administrators and presidents and chancellors, they all deeply care about students and they want to do better. But the second thing that happens when you acknowledge that it's a design problem is that you realize it's a design solution. And we can actually design our way out of this, that we can be creative, and we can make change at scale. But some of the challenges that we face that are more around the design space need to at least be acknowledged. The first is that you, as an administrator or as a faculty member, you have a lane. You know what you are asked to do and what a win would look like, and you know what a loss would look like, right? You know how to get fired. You know how to move ahead. You have a lane. You know when you should communicate with students. But what we rarely acknowledge is that students have to interact with hundreds, if not thousands, of lanes. And that is like crossing lanes of traffic. And we are over-communicating, and we are under-communicating, and there are gaps, and there are booby traps, and there are landmines. And we have to see things from the broader systemic view of how students are interacting with the enterprise. The second thing that we need to see from a systemic view is that this is what the modern higher ed administrator looks like. You recognize yourself? Everyone is incredibly, I know, Tim, right? I know. And don't even get me started on what chancellor's plates look like. Ultimately, we have this really dangerous belief in higher ed that if we just give you more work, that your plate will expand. And it's not working, and most of you can't even get through your inbox at the end of the day. We have to acknowledge and be much more creative about the capacity challenges facing us. We cannot continue to keep hiring back retirees at 0.49 and not acknowledging where there is really work to be done. The other piece that we need to think about is that when administrators have a question and they want to move and they want to innovate and they have a little bit of time, energy, and money, they turn to the higher ed sector, and this is what our culture feels like. This is how universities talk about what they do. Everything we do is not the greatest thing in the world. Sorry. And every institution is not the greatest liberal arts college of the greater Des Moines area, right? So it's problematic that we have this culture that makes it so we only tell about the amazing things and we polish everything up and we don't talk about failure and we don't share what we learned from failure, and therefore we are forcing other people to live our failure, and students are the ones who are paying the price. We have to create and change our culture so that it actually rewards the courage of vulnerability. The last piece is that we actually have to start working together. I know it's super fun to tinker in a silo in the dark, but the reality is that what we actually need to do is work together. So change is hard, it's problematic, it's difficult, but it is so much harder when you do it alone. And this is not just my idea, I'm not just saying this, I hope that you do good work in this space. I've spent the last 4 years working with institutions spanning the United States who have actually been trying to address this. In 2013, the 11 presidents and chancellors of these campuses came together, and they decided, first off, they didn't know each other. None of them they weren't friends with each other, they didn't have any relationships, there wasn't any money. So when we first came together, people rolled their eyes. And for good reason. It was yet another initiative to be announced, because that's what we're good at in higher ed, is announcing initiatives, but not necessarily following through with them. So these presidents and chancellors decided they wanted to unite around a sense of urgency, that we were not producing enough college degrees, that we were doing a pretty terrible job when it came to low-income students, first-generation students, and students of color. And going it alone to address those two problems was a massive waste of time, energy, and money. And we knew that students were the ones paying the price. So these campuses have been working together to innovate, scale up what works, and share what we've learned. They are 400,000 students, 120,000 low-income students. And over the past few years, we've actually been able to do some stuff. When we first came forward, we set a public goal. It was a stretch goal beyond all current and stretch capacity. We were going to graduate an additional 68,000 students. At least half were going to be low income. When we submitted this goal to the White House for their college summit, they didn't believe us. They made me prove that the data was actually possible for them to do this. I'm happy to share that since this happened in the last 3 years, we're now on track to produce 94,000 additional degrees in that time period. And that's that's all the campuses. I literally do not educate a single person. But what's even more promising, remember 120,000 low-income students. In 3 years, our campuses have increased their number of low-income degrees by 25%. So change is entirely possible, and you can totally do this. We've figured some things out. It's not perfect, and I hope that some of what we've learned can be helpful to you as you think about how you innovate together and you move faster together. So some of the lessons that we learned is that first you need to form a team. I know this seems really simple, but it was actually a pretty radical thing at the time. If you have a committee, that is not what I'm talking about. Any committee that exists for more than 3 years should be disbanded, and having a meeting is not an outcome. So I'll just let that. So these campuses, these teams are formed, and they are specifically focused on eliminating the delta in outcomes across race and income on our campuses. They change by the project. So sometimes IR will be on there. Sometimes financial aid will be on there. It depends. It has to evolve. And it was something that was formed by the presidents and chancellors, and they are accountable specifically for data. More importantly, we were creative about that capacity problem. We created a fellowship. These are our fellows. They are early to mid-career smart thinkers and doers who most of them represent the backgrounds of the students that we're talking to. They are many PhDs, but they don't want to be faculty. They want to work on change. They are specifically being trained in change management and shepherding innovation in a complex bureaucracy, a skill set that we know the future leaders of higher ed desperately need. So this is how the committees are then staffed by these teams, these fellows who then work with each other. The next piece is that every one of our initiatives is not just spaghetti thrown at the wall, it's actually connected. And in fact, many of them are stress testing prior year's interventions. In the last 3 years, these are our scale projects we've done. And if I had gone to school at an institution with predictive analytics, they would have known that I was registering for the wrong classes. If I'd gone to a school with proactive advising, they would have sat me down before I realized there was a problem. and financial interventions would have certainly helped. But for my campuses, you could not do proactive advising if you didn't actually implement predictive analytics. It's too easy to say that you're doing something. Our campuses actually help hold each other accountable. The last is that I want to make sure this helps and is relatable for you no matter what. When we were first formed and we were trying to figure out how to do this work, I looked everywhere. I looked at Carnegie's Improvement Science, I looked at Design School, I looked at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, I looked all over. And while I want to tell you that the best ideas came from really fancy and pedigreed places, the truth is I was really inspired by things outside of higher ed, and I would encourage you to be as well. One of the things that inspired me, Weight Watchers. It's a very simple thing, but it is one of the most effective communities of practice for improvement I've ever seen. You have to sign up for Weight Watchers and decide you're going to be in. You're going to every week weigh yourself. There's data sharing and transparency, and it's objective. And when you make progress, they praise you. They don't shame you if you don't make progress. But the most important thing is they create a community of practice where people talk about the things they're struggling with, and they help each other get better. So sometimes it doesn't need to be the fanciest idea in the world. You can actually get inspired by all kinds of places outside of the academy. The last is when people ask me what it's like to be in the Alliance. This is what it's like. So first, we convene our campuses with dynamic convenings where there are no keynotes, there are no panels, no presidents or chancellors or provosts. It is teams only and 7-minute talks and failure sharing sessions, and it's more like a workshop. But when we do that, people share hard things. So this was when Georgia State shared a really hard thing they'd gone through, which inspired one of our campuses. So we got our fellows trained in the method they talked about, which was process mapping. A very simple thing, not that innovative, but we're applying it in a special way. And so down here is where Michigan State applied process mapping, where they wanted to map out the number of emails and messages they were sending to students from the time they get admitted to the day they showed up. And they found that they were emailing 450 times in a 3-month window of time, and every one of your campuses is probably doing this too. And they found that there were 50 types of holds that a student could have on their account that they didn't know about before they got there. Every one of your campuses is likely doing this too. Very simple technique, process mapping, not that fancy and innovative, and yet it's transforming what's going on at Michigan State, and it's helping them to serve their students better. So ultimately, I just want you to know that innovation is totally possible. You can totally do this. And you can find friends and allies who are clearly in this audience today to be able to make a difference for students who are just like me and make it so that we can finally close the achievement gap. Thank you.